Well, good evening. We are back to another month. We're kind of shadowing, I think, the plan of last month, I think. Because if I understand as things shake, next week we'll have cleaning work before the gathering the day before Thanksgiving. So that's coming up later this month, pretty soon. But what I was going to do is just kind of continue a little bit of what we were doing last month. I thought I was just to do a little bit of that today, next month maybe, and then we'll start on something specific at the beginning of the year. Last month, if you were here or not, or forgotten, we were kind of looking at, in a very loose way, study methodologies without getting into like a formal how to study kind of class. I have this actually up from last time where I wrote a bunch of stuff down that is in squiggles that's really hard to read. What? Well, I'm writing on glass. But we were talking about the types of things when you look at a text, the things to ask, very common sense things. The 5 questions, right? Who, what, where, when, why. The idea of creating a bridge, a connecting idea. And some of the issues that get in the way, we talked about that with how we got the Bible. Time passes. You have a bridge between of culture, language, ideas, time itself, and then sometimes epochs if you prefer, the dispensations, the old law into the new, and so forth, and carrying over those. So I have a couple, maybe 3, but probably 2, depends on where we're going to land time-wise, of ones to look at, because last month we looked at Matthew 10 and Matthew 7. So I'm going to actually go to this one at the end here. And this is going to be a case of when translations can shade your interpretation and your thinking. Okay? A very simple reference, a very simple to understand section. It's a little difficult out of its context, but we can kind of set it up. But in Exodus 20, verse 13, in the of the 10 Commandments, you shall not murder. Thou shalt not kill. Now, before we get into kind of the nuts and bolts, I want you to just going to ask the surface question. Is there a difference in those renderings? And I'm not saying just in the usage of words. Is there a difference in meaning? Okay, I'm seeing Grover very adamantly nodding here. There's an important difference in meaning. Now, if we're going to ask the basics, because it's kind of the first thing to do, the who's, the what's, and the why's, a lot of this is going to come through the context in Exodus 20 if you read the whole thing and what's going on, but I'm just going to, for the sake of class and the fact that we should be aware generally, who is speaking here? Who is relating this information? If you remember. Who's the one holding the... It's part of the 10 Commandments. And it'll actually be reaffirmed in Deuteronomy. So it's Moses speaking. He's inspired, of course, by God to do so, but he's the speaker here. And who is he addressing? That's actually an important question when we ask the who's. Who is he addressing with this? Okay. So we've got, I'm going to put M here to Israel. They were, in essence, becoming a nation. And the way that he put it is a very good way to put it. The new nation of Israel. Had there been Israel or sons of Israel before this point? Yeah, quite a few of them. If you want to be literal, the sons of Israel were the 12 sons of Jacob. And there'll be a test later to remember all of them for all the tribes. Whenever I go through them, I always come up with 11. It's very frustrating. Anyway, but from there, you have generations that go down. How far removed is Moses from Israel / Jacob? How much time has passed? Yes, over 400 years. Sometimes we forget that. The jump between the end of Genesis, where everything is actually pretty decent. I mean, they'd sold Joseph into slavery. That's not great. And there's this whole mess with that. But he explains and as kind of was pointed out, kind of going with the theme this morning by someone, that Joseph relates, yeah, you guys did a great evil to me, but God used it for a good purpose in the end to overcome this famine. And they all settled in Egypt, and they were in the land of Goshen, which was pasture land, and everything was hunky-dory until Pharaoh died. Another Pharaoh comes along with just a title, not a name, and after 400 years, they're in bondage and so forth. So time has passed. Generations have passed. Many people lived, but Israel as an idea or a nation hadn't been born until this point. I mean, in a sense, 40 years later when they finally get into the land, but generally this law is being given and then will be reaffirmed again 40 years later in Deuteronomy. And in it we have the 10 Commandments, right? All right, so who's speaking? Moses to Israel. With that said, now that we have our speaker and our audience, and I want to be very careful about how I phrase this because I want you to get the wrong idea. Are we the directly intended audience of this section? No. We're reading someone else's mail. You're using my term. I love it. Yeah, we're reading someone else's mail. But it is a command for them. Now, is this idea reaffirmed by the new covenant? And this is the best way to do it. It's like, okay, does this apply to us directly? Well, none of the old law does. Okay, can the principle be reaffirmed under the new law? Well, if you love your neighbor, are you murdering them? Seems to fit under that subset. Of course, Paul did explain that the entire law could fit under love God and love your neighbor, and he's right. But it's reaffirmed in that notion. So we can take the principle from it. But the command, the importance of this is when you get into remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. That doesn't carry over. The other 9, as principles do. All right, let's get into the choice of translation then. Because does the word choice, is that important? Okay. What's the primary difference between the two? This is a very short, there's 4 words to play with, so you got a 1 in 4 chance. Okay, that's a good question because the original rendering is only the thing that matters. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to ask the question, and then we're going to hold that because I'm going to say which one is closest to the original rendering because that's what's going to matter. But what stands out as the difference between the translations? Okay, where are you getting at with that?
Justified or unjustified.
Okay. They were. Okay. You're explaining all of it. All I'm just saying is kill versus murder. That's all I was really looking for. Yeah.
It's intent is part of that too, almost to the point of like premeditation. Like I can drive my car and accidentally run into somebody and kill them. I can see somebody crossing the street and decide.
Yes.
Well,
see, and this is where the whole thing is going to be built upon. What is the original word? It is murder. It is murder. Why does the King James go with kill? There you go. It was more akin to purposeful homicide than the modern form of it. Kill takes on a more generic sense now. Just as the old term for hell used to mean just the grave, and it is evolved into torments. It made sense in 1611 to its audience to keep it. Okay, but in 1901, when the American Standard Version is being translated, which is generally pretty good, it's pretty close to the original, they stuck with kill for some reason. Why? Okay, here's a pot, and here's Grover. It fit the way it was known. Much like when the Revised Standard, remember that whole thing about they were vilified for changing virgin to young maiden, even though it was correct? They probably didn't want to touch it Because the problem is, what happens when you have the notion of thou shalt not kill as opposed to thou shalt not murder? That is actually it's broadening the prohibition that God has stated. And it also creates some contradictions and problems. And these are things that come up. People actually accuse the Bible of contradictions. And this is one famously that comes up that's really dumb because people only look at the King James for this. Consider. Here's the argument. God says here, thou shalt not kill. So it says kill. Then he tells them, when you enter the land, kill everything. What is going on there? It's a seeming contradiction. God is actually encouraging them to break his own law. Now, the nuances of the old law actually take into account a lot of the different things. The general term for a killing is homicide. Weirdly enough, people seem to think that homicide is the same as murder. It is not. If you kill another human being, it is a homicide. It can be justified, it can be accidental, it can be premeditated. Those are all the different elements, but it's just the thing that happens. And the old law takes that into account. An accidental killing or an accidental homicide does have a penalty under the law. You have to form restitution in various forms, but it doesn't have the same penalty that purposeful murder has. What was the penalty for murder under the old law? Execution. There was a high standard to prove it, which is why the 2 or 3 witnesses were needed, because you could accuse someone of people accuse things. That's why another element of the 10 Commandments is thou shalt not bear false witness, because it's talking about more than lying. Lying is bad, but false witness can destroy a situation. But yeah, the murder, convicted purposeful murder, the punishment was death. Is that new to the old law? When do we first see an example of the idea of capital punishment enter into the Bible? Here's your Bible Jeopardy question. What happens to Cain?
He said that there would be people willing to come out and kill me.
That's true. He figured revenge would come, but wasn't commanded. It wasn't. What was his punishment? Yeah, he was exiled. It happens after the flood. Genesis 9 includes some interesting things in there. First of all, it talks about how the animals will fear man. I alluded to this earlier. That's when we started eating meat. We were vegetarians before then. You can make a case here. We were long-lived. And blood for blood wasn't a policy yet. But at that point, it becomes set by one's, if he who sheds blood, his blood shall be shed. Now, that became kind of a general principle under the age of the patriarchs, because there were differing laws or just families around. Hammurabi had his code and different things that kind of stole from the law, but here it's codified. And the thing is, this wouldn't have surprised them. This wasn't a new idea. You shall not murder. There is a time to kill. Ecclesiastes. What is a time to kill? Okay, when is that? Wars and battles. What about under the old law? They had a very interesting system when it came to the way murders were handled. They said the penalty was death, but wasn't actually enacted by the state per se. They could have a stoning and execution, but they also had this thing of the person of kin, of the murder party was supposed to find this person and take him out. And then they could flee to a city of refuge to have their case heard in case the facts were in dispute, or they could go hold the horn of the altar. And then every Jubilee that reset, which then made me wonder, I always kind of wondered if there was just a whole slew of murders right before Jubilee, but that's a whole other mess. The system was bizarre, but it was there. The thing is, the kinsman slayer, not kinslayer, but the one who's called to do it, it isn't an option. It's not like, well, if you want to, you can get revenge. This was not the way it worked, because it wasn't revenge in man's sense. It was, no, you are the vessel God is going to use to bring this judgment. You are commanded to kill. Mm-hmm.
Also, since it was a theocracy, God could actually answer their question. Is this true or not?
It's true. With the Urim and Thummim, that could happen. And also just through inspiration of the prophets, various peoples, or the judges at their time. So there's all these elements in play. There's all these things that kind of flow from it. The problem is we tend to take, again, and this is the bridge, 21st century Western thinking, and shove it to 10th century BC Eastern thinking. We're removed. We have a very different system of law. We have a different, remember, like you're saying, it's a theocracy. It's also their religion was their state. They were one and the same. Okay, we've kind of broadened, because it's a fun discussion from this. But here, the difference in a word is very, very, very important. Because this has led to many people to make varied conclusions about the Christian ethos, even though this is in the Old Testament. This has led to, for instance, those of the extreme pacifist perspective. No self-defense. When Jesus says, turn the other cheek, let someone beat you up, which isn't what he means, but that's its own discussion. That's one we can look at too. But it's because we're not supposed to kill. Well, I mean, how far do you want to take that? Animals? You stepped on an ant? Your immune system's killing viruses? I mean, this is, of course, oh, that's silly. This is dealing with human beings. Okay. But there's a difference between thou shalt not murder and thou shalt not kill.
Like in the movie Psycho, I won't even kill this fly. I'm harmless to this.
That's a reference.
Besides the Quakers, I imagine there are other religious groups today that are pacifists like that.
Yes.
Believe in this.
Yeah, it's a thing. And it comes into the question of capital punishment, which gets very interesting because Paul says the state does not bear the sword in vain, which is a strong, at least, implication that the state, the sword there is the judgment sword. God puts governments in place and they can do that. This is led to discussions when I was at preaching school, different things like, and a lot of it can come from a misunderstanding, because for a very, very, very long time, it read, thou shalt not kill. This may not have the same impact now after the newer translations, but for a very long time, this is what it was known as. And people were like, well, God says not to kill, and then he tells them to kill. No, God said don't murder. Look at what the Hebrew says. But this is a case where you want to be very careful, and this is why looking at multiple translations can be of benefit. I haven't done that in every case with these. We look a lot at the New American Standard, but this is why you want to do that on occasion. Because sometimes if you have a contradiction that seems to prop up, or some sort of situation that doesn't seem to fit with what's going on, with the flow of everything, find a different rendering. I mean, all right, look at the original if you're familiar with those languages. But if you can't do that, find a different rendering, because it might shake things up a little bit in your way of approaching it. It might not be any better. It could actually be worse, but it's different. This is where this one comes from.
This is where a person's personal library should include not only the Bible, but also like Smith's and Young's Analytical Concordance.
Okay.
You get into the weeds. You have to. Some of these translations are politically motivated.
They all have their bents. They all have their directions. And when you say politically, people may not fully get what that means. It can be venerating a particular king, but sometimes it can just come to a particular doctrine, and that's another way of looking at it. The New American Standard leans that way. We saw that with, I think it was last week's class in the Revelation, where it included some italicized added words about a coming kingdom that were unnecessary. Okay. Oh, yep.
Bible translations are put out by Bible publishing companies. They're in business to make money. That's the underlying principle. And thou shalt not publish an offensive translation. You want to sell as many Bibles as you can to as many different people as you can. Catholics, Protestants, everybody.
Because you mentioned that one version that everybody was so mad at, nobody.
That was the Revised Standard, yeah. It got burned. And it was because they decided to stick to the original text. And people leapt to the wrong conclusion. And that's the thing. It's like you can get the meaning out. These kind of things are dangerous in and of themselves, but it's the conclusions that are bred from bad facts that lead to false teachings, that then lead to weird outcomes.
So how accurate is Strong's dictionary or Strong's number? So if I have King James with Strong's and I don't like the way King James says something and I look over
Well,
the ESV and it's different, I go to Strong's?
Well, Strong's is a concordance.
Okay.
It will give you a listing of all the different usages of a particular word in a translation. The original Strong's is keyed to King James, but they have made them for the other translations. All it's going to do is tell you every time kill will show up. It's not going to define anything for you. But if you have Vines is a pretty decent English keyed dictionary for both Hebrew and Greek, it will give you a lot of differing background, and it'll point you toward the thing that what Strong's will do is it'll give you a number, the Strong's number. And then if you go to a Greek or Hebrew dictionary, even if you can't read those things, if you find that number, you can find the original word and find a definition. But that's a different book. But a lot of these resources, some of them aren't, but a lot of them are public domain now, and they're free electronically. Brown Driver Briggs is a an Old Testament Hebrew one that's free. New Testament's a little tougher. Those can get pricey. I get excited when I find a dictionary set that's only like a couple $100 for 10 volumes, because it's that kind of stuff. But
Some software applications use Strong's, at least one is very
Mhm.
narrow that I'm familiar. And when it takes you there, it shows the different usages, and it'll give some of the original meaning.
and usually it's feeding off of,
The low level, I guess,
yeah.
distinction that's made in the different usages.
The way software usually does it is a lot of times you'll click a word and it'll have a little pop-up, and like, here's the number in Strong's, here's the references, and then here's some dictionary, and it's pulling from a dictionary. It's pulling from like a bunch of different sources and then condensing it for you. And that can be very useful. There's paid software that does that. eSword is free. It does that.
Yeah, the nice thing about that is with Strong's, and you've got that, if you've got that electronic version, then you can click that and bring it up in every other instance that it was used, and try to see how it was used in context here, and maybe kind of figure out what they're talking about here.
You can. The downside is it's still keyed to an English word. If you want, okay. We're really going down like the interpretive.
You just got a subject matter for a whole new series of classes.
Yeah, it's a how to study class, which I can do. I just didn't know if there was a huge interest in that. Okay, there is it's the Englishman's Greek Concordance. It's like 15, 20 bucks because it's public domain. It is a Greek concordance keyed to Greek words for their usage in the Greek New Testament. I don't know if there's the Englishman's, believe it or not, that's a dumb name, but the Englishman's Greek Concordance. I have one. I can show it to you guys afterward if you want to. That is the way to where if you go, okay, got my Strong's word, this is agape. Agape, this is what agape looks like. It'll give you every usage of agape in the Greek New Testament. That is the perfect concordance because it's not tied to a translation. That's the only thing with Strong's. You can find different usages of it, or you can just find different bad usages of it, is the problem, because it's going to come from a particular translation. So, all right, let's look at our second one and slay, because I think we'll have time to do a second one. I don't think we'll have time for three, but that's fine. This one is going to probably irritate, or it's killing a sacred cow. I want to prepare you for this, okay? This is a very, very popular pair of verses. I don't know if I want to do this. Okay. Matthew 18:20. For where two or three have gathered together in my name, I am there in their midst.
For what purpose was the gathering?
Okay, you're asking questions ahead of time, my friend. Okay. Let's start with the simples. Let's start with the basics here. Let's start with the core of what's going on here. Who is speaking in this context? Okay. It is Christ. It is Christ. He is finishing, actually, a discourse in Matthew 18. that will explain a lot of what's going on, though we kind of get hung up on verses 15 and following because it deals with church discipline. This is at the tail end of that. And forget that the greater you found my English ones? Nice. The greater context of it all is dealing with forgiveness. Like beforehand, he's talking about it. After this verse, he's going to talk about the 99. So that, or no, just forgiveness. The 99 was before it. I saw both listings that I went, which is about restoration and so forth, which is the goal of discipline, by the way. Okay, so we've established the speaker here, the who. The speaker is Jesus. To whom is he speaking? Is it, and again, you have to look maybe at the text to answer that question. Earlier in chapter 18, it begins with, at that time, verse 1, the disciples came to Jesus and said, "Who then is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" This is what's setting up the whole thing. Mark has a similar discourse. He calls a child to himself and said to him, "Truly, unless you are converted and become like little children, you not enter the kingdom of heaven. Whoever humbles himself as a child is the greatest, and whoever receives such," and he talks about causing one of the little ones to stumble and so forth. So it's possibly a conversation just with his disciples, though it's a case where Jesus does like to take a disciple's question and then turn it into a teaching opportunity to a crowd. I don't think it's limited to the 12. It's at least broader than that of his general followers. That's at least how I read it. You can argue it out. But he is teaching his followers, or I'll just put D for disciples. So he's not dealing with a hostile audience here. That's important. He's teaching. He's teaching something directly. Okay, when is this? Okay, who, what is this talking about? The what subject matter is in the context. And that's going to be answered by answering the question of the gathering that Grover brought up. We'll hold that. Who, what, where is this? That one doesn't have a whole bunch of meaning. Sometimes location can be important. This is in that region. I can't remember if it's in Galilee or which part he's at the particular time, but it's not location specific, so that's not a huge question. When? Again, first century, during the ministry of Christ. So it's before the new covenant, but it's speaking about things that will be important in the new covenant. So it's kind of riding the edge there. It's looking forward. Why? Well, there's some words in this verse that stand out. Okay, we've looked at gathered together stands out. What else stands out? Okay, the numbers. 2 or 3. Will those have significance? Well, look at the context, and we'll see if we see those numbers show up anywhere. Anything else? My name. Okay. Anything else? Okay. He isn't using his name of God there, but I am can be there. Yeah, I am is can be powerful. Amidst is probably the big one that's talking about presence, closeness, dwelling with. Okay, so we've almost highlighted everything. Great. Okay. How? I don't know if I want to go there or not. How is this? I'll just do it. How is this verse commonly referenced? What general principle is typically taken from this verse?
Typically talking about worship, when everybody gathers together, the Lord here worshiping with us, it's a presence, it's authority, which is certainly out of context.
Okay, so it many times is used in a worshipful context. It has been taken even by some, and I've seen it on bulletins, I've seen it on various things. The general principle, when you have more than one Christian together, 2 or 3, it creates a unique situation which allows for them together to worship. Is it possible, given a particular circumstance, for 2 Christians to worship together? Yes, it does. Yes, it does. And that's what's going to be very, very, very important. Yeah. That's why I highlighted those numbers. But is it possible for, because of circumstance, two Christians to be together and to worship together, and it just be two of them? Okay. Here's a question. Is it possible for a circumstance to exist where you have to worship by yourself? Well, wouldn't that negate this? If John is on Patmos and by himself, and he's in the Spirit on the Lord's day, and he's trying to worship, is Christ not there? Because he's by himself. See, when you take a principle and you reverse it, you invert it, and you have a bad conclusion, you can have a problem. What will happen is this verse has been used by many to justify, and I don't want to run to the nth degree with this, okay? Because there are times when we need to gather in smaller groups, and there are times when we do that, and we separate and do different things. But as a pattern of behavior, to avoid the assembly because as long as he's with someone else, it's fine, which is a bigger problem, like a Hebrews 10 issue, that are missing out on all the benefits that come with being a part of the assembly and different things. But it's used to justify that. The question becomes, is Jesus describing anything of a worshipful context in Matthew 18 to this point?
Not a worship service, quote, unquote.
Okay. Let's read verses 15 through 19 if you have it, because it's right before it. Because this sets up, and this is the tail end verse on a 6-verse pericope or section, that's the fancy word, that completes the thought. If your brother sins, go and show him his fault in private. If he listens to you, you've won your brother. But if he does not listen to you, take one or two more with you, so that, and then he quotes from the Old Testament, by the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, every fact may be confirmed. If he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if he refuses to listen even to the church, let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. Truly, I say to you, whatever you bind on earth shall have been bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall have been loosed in heaven. Again, I say to you that if 2 of you agree on earth about anything that they may ask, it shall be done for them by my Father who is in heaven. For where 2 or 3 are gathered together, in my name, I am there in their midst. Ooh, okay. So we have this little aside here in verses 18 and 19. And what verse 18 is doing is it's reaffirming a statement that came from chapter 16 that was said to Peter, and here is being told to the apostles that whatever they bind and loose on earth, meaning the boundaries they are inspired to set, the writings that they are going to give, the commands, are going to mirror what's in heaven. Whatever God has bound and loosed is going to be the same here. And you get these ideas of binding and loosing. That's where those terms come from. That idea of the constraints. Someone that comes along and says, you can't do this, or makes new rules that God hasn't, that's binding where you shouldn't. That's constraining it. Someone that comes along and says, I know it says this, but it's okay to do this. We can do whatever we want. That's loosing. And finding those boundaries is important. That's what this is talking about. Verse 19, if 2 of you agree on earth about anything that they may ask, it shall be done for them who is my Father in heaven. Okay, you could run with that to a general principle. Hey, get 2 of us together. Chris, you and I, we're getting Corvettes, each of us from God. You agree? 100%. Okay, it's going to happen. Right? No, that's not the principle that's there. To agree, in this case, contextually flowing, because they're both inspired men that are of the same mind, and it's coming together. Now, they don't necessarily have to be inspired, because if we carry forward the principles then from discipline, it's decision-making. This isn't a section of Scripture that people like to look at very much. Yeah, that's 19. But what's going on here with church discipline? Well, establishing facts can be a tough thing. But let's just look at the progression of it. Let's look at the progression of it. If your brother sins, okay, and we could go a long time on this subject because there's a lot of things. This is someone caught in a trespass. And it has to be, obviously, something that's not rumor. It's not gossip. It's only gossip because it's true. No. It's not gossip if it's true. No. Because there are witnesses. So facts are established. They're caught in a trespass. Either they did something to a particular party, or they're doing something that they shouldn't, that became aware by said parties. Much like Galatians, you want to go and try to help such a person with care. The implication here is there's a confrontation. Now, this confrontation is done in love. Show him his fault in private. Why? But why? Why is it a private thing? I mean, we're hiding stuff here. It's secretive. Why are we doing this in private? You don't need to air the dirty laundry of everything. Everyone doesn't know everything about everything. And here's the other possibility. Is there the possibility of a misunderstanding? So when you confront them in private, it can be resolved. If you're the wounded party, you are called to go and talk to the person who offended. That's another biblical principle. And when we fail to do this, when we get mad at someone and then don't talk to them, and they don't know they've done something, and then you're bitter about it 20 years later and like, I had no idea. It's about communication. If you cause offense, you're supposed to take care of that. There's a principle even that he talks about taking care of that before you make your offering. Get it out of the way. But this seems to be confronting. If he listens to you, you have won your brother. What is the ultimate goal? Is to win him back. Him, her, brother, win their soul back. That's why we have the 90 and 9 right before it. A lost straying sheep is returned. And forgiveness comes after this section. We forgive the trespass. However, what happens if you have a scenario with a Christian or someone claiming to be a Christian who has done something wantonly wrong, and now it's been confronted and they just don't want to deal with it? They're being unrepentant, and that's the key here. And this is where it gets really tough sometimes when there's he said, she said things. But if it's an established thing and they admit, yeah, I did it, but I don't care, what do? Well, you take with one or two more with you to witness their unrepentance. So it's not just a he said, she said situation. It's a second attempt. Second attempt. 2 or 3 witnesses. Every fact may be confirmed is the thing there. Well, what fact is in dispute here? In this particular case, it's whether or not they're listening. Because the scenario given is that they've been confronted with something, they're not denying it, or there's not a misunderstanding, they're just refusing to face it. Then if they refuse to listen, you tell it to whom? To the church. In Matthew, the word here is ecclesia, the word commonly used for church. Interesting. Jesus says, tell it to the assembly, or the called out, to the church. Was there a church when he was saying this? Not yet, but he's already preparing them ahead of time for what is to come. Then you tell the assembly. This is the step that can get you into a lot of trouble if you're not careful. And if he refuses to listen to even the body, the church, let him be to you as a Gentile tax collector. Cut them off, disfellowship them. Not because you don't like them, not because you don't want the best for them, but to separate them from the body. A, to remove the leaven that can leaven the lump, because they're a bad influence. And 2, the idea is if they're a part of the body and they're part of something that's working together and part of something that's loving and great, the separation hopefully will shock them into realizing what they're missing, so they'll want to come back. Because the goal is restoration. If your body isn't as such to where they're going to miss it when they're not there, you've got a bigger problem. It's not going to be as effective. Now again, telling it to the church, this is something that doesn't happen very often when you want to confront this thing, but it's been recommended that if something like this is to occur, dismiss all visitors and have a special meeting, because that establishes, since legally it's a club, for lack of a better term, in their eyes, and you can dispel members, but if you just because there was a congregation that was successfully sued by a woman that was confronted for promiscuity publicly because they didn't dismiss the visitors. And she was like, well, that's defamation. The irony is it's true, but it's still defamation. Or is it libel? No, it wasn't libel, because that's printed. J. Jonah Jameson told us that. It's not slander, it's libel. Yeah. With all this in mind, we're setting up, what we've done is we've just gone a few verses back, 2 or 3. And you got to consider the flow of what he's saying as a natural conversation, too. You're hearing these things as they're being said. What is the natural, where do you naturally go in your thinking as it's going along? Okay, he's saying certain things. I don't fully understand what he's talking about because he's talking about a church, but this is going to be important later, okay? And okay, this makes sense. You confront them, and then he says, you know, whatever shall be bound on earth and so forth. 2 of you agree, okay? Well, what would we be agreeing on? Well, obviously on this particular issue, where 2 or 3 have gathered together in my name, I am there in their midst. How is this a cap-end statement that fits the context? What's he saying then? Why are they gathering together? To deal with the issue. People would know it's a gathering. Any gathering. It's a worshipful gathering. But contextually, that's not what it's saying. And a lot of the rest of the New Testament is going to be in opposition to the general principle they're trying to draw from it. You really should be with the body if you can. Now, not every Christian can. There are circumstances, there are things. There are times when Paul is traveling, and he didn't travel alone typically unless he had to. Sometimes when he had to flee, for the reason he'd have someone with him so that he could worship with them. And they'd have to do it on the road. But he also tarried in Ephesus for 6 days, even though he was in a hurry, to be with the body. But if we read it as, okay, they're gathering together. Now, why would it be important to hear? Because you're dealing with some really serious stuff here. You have a brother, sister, a fellow Christian whose soul you're concerned about. This isn't something that we're raising just to be a court of Pharisees or Sanhedrin and to lord over people and to kick them out. And no, those are the wrong motivations. This is someone who you're scared for because they're doing something that's destructive to their soul and it's bad and they don't want to confront it and you're trying to help them and they keep refusing, and so you're trying to say, hey, this is now a thing everyone has to know about. We need to help this person. Might there be a bit of doubt in your brain that what you're doing is the right choice? What does Jesus say? Where 2 or 3 are gathered, when you have those witnesses, when you have 2 of like mind that are doing things according to my will, be it in their case perhaps an inspired event, but it's the general principle carries over as long as it's according to the word. It's not a singular will. It's not just my mind, it's not just someone else's mind. You're together for that purpose, and this is the right decision to make biblically. You can be confident in your decision because it's not you making the decision. I am there with you I'm with you there in their midst. I'm with them in the decision. But this comes across by highlighting the different things. Notice there, again, in my name. That was another one we highlighted. My name is authority. Not of their own authority, not of their own lordship, not of their own, I just don't like this person, so I'm going to figure out a way to kick him out. I'm going to vote him out. That's not how it works, but no, they're there in Christ's name. So to his glory, to his betterment. And there are times the evil has to be removed. False teaching is what comes to mind. Problem is it always deals with personalities and things aren't always as clear as they should be. And not everyone always has all the information, but it's a part of it. That changes it, doesn't it? That changes it. Which is, again, part of the danger of just taking a verse and running with it. though I did put just one verse up there, but it was illustrative. There are other examples we can look at in different things. What I think I'll do is save them for just one more, or one or two more. Where are we at? I mean, we're at 5:50, so it's not really, 10 minutes is a long time to get into anything else. What thoughts do we have we want to share? If any.
This is why it's so important to take everything in context when you read.
Mm-hmm.
Extremely important. And may lead to the fact that if you're going to a singular word and trying to determine what that means based on other things in other context, that might not always be right either. It's got to be in the context of that particular verse.
Yes. What defines context? I mean, it's a very basic question, but what defines the context? It's no, oh, sorry.
The immediate context is Jewish people within the Jewish covenant. That's the immediate context.
Oh, yeah,
Instructions to them for their time and their place.
Well,
Which will have parallels that will carry over. How
Okay.
quickly and how far we carry them is another matter.
Okay, that fits kind of the cultural mode and cultural world they lived in. I was meaning in the text itself, like as a piece of writing. But that's true too. And in this case, it's unusual because Christ again is kind of he's speaking to Jews under the old law, but he's saying a lot of things that are preparing them for the kingdom. So even though it's still under the old law, it applies to the church. Now there are teachings out there that say that's not true. Well, it happened before Pentecost, therefore it doesn't apply. And it's like, then why do we have the Gospels? Because they're trying to get around certain teachings.
This immediate context would be disagreements among brethren,
Disagreements among brethren, certainly.
which is a narrow context.
It is. It's a very limited situation, actually, that we're talking about, Lord willing, right? But in terms of a text, is the context dictated by where the translator decides to put a chapter break? No. Is it dictated where the verse break ends? No. The little fun, nice headings they put in there for help, those are aids. But those don't necessarily defend the context. Context is it's something about.
It goes back to what you were saying earlier, the who, what, when, where.
Yeah. Find the entire chunk of the discourse. Now that can be pretty long with something like the Sermon on the Mount, is it's an entire context of 3 chapters really, and then it has little pieces because he kind of talks about forgiveness, he talks about giving, he talks about worry, he talks about different things. But inside of a book itself can be a context. If you're talking about words, words can differ by usage by author. Paul will use righteousness, for instance, in Romans differently than Matthew will use righteousness in Matthew. Paul says there's none righteous, no, not one. Matthew, inspired, has the words of Christ, be ye holy like I'm holy, and unless your righteousness surpasses the scribes and the Pharisees, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. Well, there's none righteous. How is that possible? It's because he's focusing on your own pattern of behavior, whereas Paul is focusing on the perfectionist part of it. Another famous example, Paul used works in Romans very differently than James will use works in James, and they're complementary. But it's going to come to how even an author uses it. So sometimes if it's just, you want to stay within that author. Paul's one you can jump around a little bit because he's pretty consistent throughout his writings, even though he does use faith slightly differently in Romans 14, which is frustrating. But it can come down to just the author. It can come down to the New Testament versus the Old Testament. It can come down to the type of literature. As long as you're thinking about these things and not just going, you're already ahead of 90% of who's out there. So.
Well, there are people that think the Bible is full of contradictions, and it's because they don't understand that difference between Romans and Matthew, for instance.
Yeah. Or they're treating it like a storybook written by a singular author, as opposed to a library of writings inspired by the same source, but with differing authors, with differing styles, and differing purposes. The Bible is a library. Bible is probably not the correct name even, because that just means the book. It's the books. It should be plural, but regarded as such. also makes it different than the Quran and the Book of Mormon. They're singular. Anyway, that's free. Any other thoughts?
It's the disposition of the person reading it. What is their intent? What's their attitude?
Mm-hmm.
Some are hostile no matter what.
Well, again, that comes down to what you're going to bring to it, and that's the baggage. That's the personal baggage. Are you bringing things to it that are going to get in the way? Well, then you are taking your thoughts and pushing it into the text. That's eisegesis, or you're letting the text be pulled out. That's exegesis. Those are the terms. Yeah, a how to studies class is a whole thing.
But seemingly essential.
Yep. Okay. Any other thoughts this evening?
You could open that up to the entire community.
Certainly.
Hold the class out in the FAC.
Okay.
We offer credit? What you should charge for credit hours.
The humanities credit. Is there anyone here that needs the Lord's Supper this evening? I don't know if he does. Okay. Well, then what I will do is hand it over to you. You can make your announcement, and then you can close it. Okay.
Everyone aware, we got the announcement this morning, but we weren't really sure. We didn't have enough details, so we didn't share from the pulpit, but we did get all the information verified. But Chris Crockett, many of you know, knew Bill and Betty, their son Chris. He's been taking care of him and his wife Janice. Janice suffers from Parkinson's. They're down in College Station, but he suffered a heart attack in the night a couple nights ago, and he did pass away. So we kind of got the fact that he'd passed, but we weren't really sure. So I've got the information I wanted to make sure to share. There'll be a memorial service for Chris November 15th at 10 o'clock at Hillier Funeral Home in College Station. So the memorial will be at 10. There'll be a visitation at 9 o'clock, immediately preceding the service. So if you've got other questions or want more details, I've got a few other things to share. But the main thing we want to let you know that Chris did pass, and that we do have his service information down in College Station on the 15th. Okay. Are there any other announcements? Anything else anyone wants to make sure is known? Yes. So next week, instead of class, we will have another work evening. Just to kind of get all the last minute things put together. Make sure we've got everything cleaned up and set and ready to go in advance of hosting the area Thanksgiving service. And so be looking around. If you see something, that needs to be done, bring whatever you need to do it. Yes, sir. I know, no, it's not directly, because we had a beehive in there once, and so we actually had to cut the paneling out to get the beehive. So I think there's studs behind that. You'll just have to find studs. Didn't know that. Blind squirrel finds a nut every now and then. All right, any others? All right, thank you for being here. Enjoyed it. Like I said, sometimes getting in the weeds is kind of fun. Being able to really parse some things apart. So thank you for that, Eric. All right, let's bow our heads and we'll pray and we'll be dismissed. Our Father God, thank you for being with us here this evening as we gather here together to continue to study, to learn how to study, to be able to understand the things that when people outside of these walls ask us those questions, that we have a ready answer, that we're able to meet some of those things that are put before us, to be able to explain those things so that we can continue to bring others closer to you. Praise you be with us as we leave this place this evening, as we move into our work week and dealing with
stresses and worries and all of those things, Lord, just pray that you would help to keep us grounded, keep us moving in a positive direction because we have you to lean on. We pray for those that are grieving right now, for the Crockett family. We pray for those that are dealing with illnesses and sicknesses, Lord. Just pray that you'd be with them, comfort them, for be your will to heal them up so they can be out and about like they would like to do. Again, we thank you for your Son, Jesus, for his willingness to die in our stead. And it's in his name we pray all things. Amen.